Fiocchi Defense Dynamics 357 Magnum snub nose ammo test with Dan the Wolfman. So he sent me some 125 grain Fiocchi Defense Dynamics ammunition. And I looked through the inventory stuff that I happen to have on hand, and I happen to have some 148 grain and some 158 grain Fiocchi Defense Dynamics, and I realized I only ever tested those through the 4-inch barrel. I never tested any of those through a snub nose barrel, so I thought it'd be interesting to pull out our 148 grain and our 158 grain and test those along with the 125 grain that Dan the Wolfman sent. And I put his custom grips on my Taurus 605 here with the 2-inch barrel that I'm going to test those test this from. You can get those grips at customwolfgrips.com or premiumgrips.com. He sent me these over for free for a Christmas present. Very nice looking grips overall. And they do feel my hand a lot better than some of the rubber grips, and so I actually do like shooting those with those on that. I looked myself at the website. He's not asking me to like promote these or anything, but I did myself go look at the website, and I was kind of surprised at the pricing of these, because for engraved grips, that's a pretty fair price that those are at. In the past, I tested this Fiocchi Defense Dynamics 357 Magnum 148 grain and 158 grain, and what I got, you know, we have a rated velocity of 1310 for our 148 grain. I actually only got 1168 through the 4-inch barrel. 158 grain rated at 1220, I only got 1120 feet per second, so lost 100 and 142 feet per second respectively. Now the 125 grain that he set are rated at 1450 feet per second, but based on the velocity as I got with the 148 grain and the 158 grain, there's just no way I'm going to get rated velocity. I don't trust that. But here's the thing, a lot of times when I get ammo like this where it's really low below rated velocity in a 4-inch barrel, basically it becomes a very pleasant round to shoot. So that kind of becomes a de facto short barrel load, that, you know, it's loaded lighter, so it's going to be easier to handle through a snub nose barrel. So that's kind of what I'm looking at doing here, is to see if these are good in a short barreled revolver, because they should have less recoil than typical. So we're going to go through the chronograph, see what kind of velocity and accuracy we get at the same time. Then I'm going to do my 10% clear ballistic test. We're going to go into plain clear ballistics, 10% clear ballistics, just a plain clear ballistic shot to see what the best potential for expansion and penetration is. Then after that, I'm going to do more of a real world simulation where I have 4 layers of sweatshirt material on this first 3-inch piece that represents our pectoral muscle. After that, we'll have a 1/4-inch medium density fiberboard that's going to represent hitting ribs or sternum. That'll be more of our real world simulation shot. So we'll do a plain clear ballistic shot and then a real world simulation shot, and then I will shoot at my steel target to see what kind of practical accuracy, recoil control, and all of that I can get with these. So let's get started with this test. I'm back 7 yards from the target. I'm generally up at 5 yards, but I'm at 7 yards now because I started seeing issues that are specific to 357 Magnum in a snub nose that I don't see with other calibers and configurations. That is, you know, I ran 3 rounds of 22 mag to make sure my chronograph angles were lined up right and the lighting's right. Read 3 rounds just fine. Then I shot 3 rounds of 357 Magnum, didn't read a single one of those. Shot 3 more rounds of 22 mag, it read every one of those. And generally when that happens, it's because there's too much muzzle flash and it's putting too much light over those sensors. But when I come back to 7 yards as opposed to 5 yards, it generally reads a little bit better. So we'll do our 357 Magnum 158 grain, see what this does. Not sure if that was a read. Yeah, it was. So our 158 grain, I mean, you gotta understand that's a 158 grain. That is pretty heavy bullet, so I could see why that got such a slow reading there. Then I'm gonna load up our 148 grain rounds here. By the way, those were rated at 1220, so we got a couple 100 feet per second below rated velocity. These are rated at 1310. Let's see what our 148 grains do here. $1,097, 1,086, having trouble with these gloves. 1,076. Yeah, these are kind of thick gloves, but with the wind chill, it is 10 degrees out today, so I'm trying to protect my skin here, so I'm going to grab some 125 grain, see how these do. All right, 125 grain. These are rated at 1450. Generally, a 125 grain rated at 1450 does about 1250 out of this gun. So let's see how close we get to about 1250 then. $11.32. $11.52. $1,094. Now I will admit, you know, they're well below rated velocity, but the recoil is less with these, and that's the whole point of these. I knew that they were going to be a lot less powerful than typical Magnums, and that's the whole point here, is to try to find a load that's becomes kind of a de facto short barrel load. And what they do for short barrel loads, like Spear Gold Dot 135 grain, is they simply load it very light with a different style bullet. With these are a lot cheaper, and we're simply loaded real light. Now the challenge here is, will these bullet designs actually expand at these low velocities? So let's hit our ballistics gel block and find out. All right, our plain clear ballistic test. No denim in the way to clog a hollow point or anything like that. No rib simulation to slow down penetration. And I do have these all coded so I know which ones are which. 3 dots on the back of the 158 grain cartridges, 2 dots with a Sharpie for the 148 grains, and 1 dot with the 125 grains, so that I don't mix any of these up. So I'm gonna get really close on these shots to make sure that I can make, you know, precise shots in that gel block without hitting another bullet. So let's see what I can get here with our 158 grain. All right, let's hit our 148 grain and our 125 grain. Let's do that. Let's go take a look. All right, kind of what you might expect, but kind of not. I would have expected the most penetration with the 158 grain on the bottom, but we did not get the most penetration with that. Very similar with our 148 grain. We have some fragmentation with every one of these bullets. But one thing is certain, they all had straight line penetration and they all did a ton of damage. So looking at this here, our energy dump in the first 3 inches, our 158 on the bottom, our 148 in the middle, and 125 up top. It looks like our 158 grain did not energy dump quite as good, and our damage isn't quite as good with our 158 grain. And that's partly, you know, it is moving, barely moving at 1,000 feet per second, but it is a 158 grain, so it still has a lot of energy. Our 148 grain and our 125 grain look really good, but it looks like our expansion with our 148 grain is not particularly great either. So with our 158 grain, we have a penetration of 20 inches. Our 148 grain, it looks like about 20.25 inches. And with our 125 grain, we have 17.5 inches. So all those are pretty acceptable for what they are. But I would say, you know, because we had pretty much the most energy dump and we didn't over penetrate, I think our 125 grain did the best in this particular test. So let's put on our fabric, put in our medium density fiberboard rib simulation, see how to continue to compare that way. All right, 4 layers of sweatshirt material, 3 inches of clear ballistics, a 1/4 inch medium density fiberboard, our real world simulation, 158 grain, 148 grain, and 125. Let's go take a look. All right, so we had proper holes through all these. It does look like that our 158 grain's tumbling. Our 148 grain's moving straight and expanding. Our 125 grain looks like it had some inconsistent expansion. But when I look at these bullets, one of them didn't have any expansion at all, and that's our 158 grain. But it had a lot of damage in there, and the reason why is because it was tumbling. So with our 158 grain, what we got is a penetration of 18 3/4 inches with no expansion at all. With our 148 grain, ton of damage, and we have fantastic expansion. With our 148 grain, 16 inches. Who would have thought? And our 125 grain, we have only part of that bullet expanding, and we have a penetration of 15.5 inches. So looking at this test as a whole, our 148 grain is the best choice here as far as terminal ballistics goes. I would have thought the 125 grain would have done better, but it looks like our 148 grain is the clear winner here because we got some fantastic expansion. I know a lot of people will be like, that's just one shot, you know, you got to do that a bunch of times to confirm that. And my thought always is on that is a fail is a fail. If it fails one time, that's too many times. So if you take one shot and you get a failure on something, that's enough for me. Now you could say, well, if you got a success with one shot, well, maybe you just got lucky, maybe. But you know, at these velocities, there's really not a whole lot of weird stuff that could go on. You know, if we were talking just barely below or just barely above expansion threshold velocity, yeah, I could see that. But with all of them being pretty much over expansion threshold velocity, except maybe the 158 grain, I would say that what you're going to get is what you're going to get with every shot. So our 148 grain did the best here in my opinion. So let's pull these out of the block. We'll take a close-up look at them, then I'll shoot our steel, see what kind of practical shootability I can get with these. All right, so here's a close-up look at these bullets going through our plain gel, our 125, our 148, and our 158 grain. There's our 125 grain. Inconsistent expansion, but still pretty big expansion. Our 148 grain through plain gel, again, inconsistent expansion. And our 158 grain, a little more consistent, but you know, not great looking overall. Now going through our medium density fiberboard, everything changes up a little bit here. There's our 158 grain, not really any expansion at all. Doesn't look particularly good. Our 148 grain, this is weird because it got really good expansion. And our 125 grain actually expanded much like it did through a plain gel. Inconsistent, but you know, it still had pretty decent expansion, just kind of inconsistent here. So our 158 grain, our 148 grain, our 125 grain. So honestly, you look at the consistency here, even though our 148 grain had the most consistent through our MDF expansion, when you're talking from one shot to the other, our 125 grain, as weird as that looks, actually was the most consistent weird expansion overall. So yeah, that's a close-up look at those bullets. All right, 12 yards from the target. We're just gonna see what kind of practical shootability I can get with these. And what I mean by that is just, you know, getting a sight picture and popping these off as fast as I think I can hit the target. I'm not going for slow group size or anything like that. I'm just seeing, you know, if I'm not trying too hard, just, you know, aiming kind of at the target, trying to kind of simulate a real, you know, circumstance where I'm not going to have great sight picture and all that, how these things would all shoot for me. That's basically why I do that. So our 158 grain, let's see if I can do it thus. A little bit of a handful to control, to be honest. I did pull one completely over the target, it looks like. Next up, we got our 148 grains. So I'm using a click loader thing here, and it doesn't seem to want to be working with these grips very well. But here's our 148 grains. Let's see what these things will do for me. All right, so it appears that we have a dead primer with one of these Fiocchi 148 grains. So I'm gonna wait here just a moment, make sure that doesn't fire. Holding it pretty tight, you know, just in case it does. I've never had that happen. I don't know of anybody else that's ever had that happen, but you're supposed to wait about a minute. But pull this out. Yep, hard primer. Primer wasn't hit very hard, which just basically indicates it's a cheap primer or a primer of opportunity, possibly a rifle primer. Keep going. I'll hit it again. So yeah, those hurt pretty bad as well. Now we'll do our 125 grain. These didn't have that much muzzle rise compared to the others, so let's see what this does for me. So this is the most comfortable to shoot. I'm not saying it is comfortable, but out of the 3 bullet weights, it's the most comfortable here. So looking at this here, what we can say is that our 148 grain had the best terminal ballistics, had the best terminal performance in the gel block, our 148 grain. Our 158 grain, not so much. And comparing the 148 to the 158 grain, I would say the recoil is about the same, but our 148 grain was superior with our terminal ballistics. Now our 125 grain, here's the thing. It's, you know, expansion through the MDF and everything wasn't that great, but we didn't get any over penetration, and the recoil was a lot different with the 125 grain versus these other two. These other two, even though they're low powered, they still felt like a 357 Magnum, and they hurt to shoot. Our 125 grain, that felt more like a warm 38 Special Plus P. So even though our winner for terminal ballistics is definitely our 148 grain, if you can make a shot with that, that's the best performing round. But I would say our overall best choice here, if I was going to pick one of these to carry, I would carry the 125 grain, because we still had really good velocity. We didn't over penetrate. It still dumped its energy quite well, and it was a lot easier to land shots on target. And from just my basic, you know, shooting at the target without trying that hard, you can see I missed with the 148 and the 158 grain at least one shot, but with the 125s, no problem at all. Now we did have a hard primer on one of those rounds, and that's just the name of the game sometimes when you're talking cheap ammo, that happens. But with a revolver, you can pull that trigger again. It's unlikely you'd get a hang fire with a hard primer, so you could just pull that trigger again and get another shot. But overall, not terrible performance. If I would probably pick something different, but honestly, I would feel pretty comfortable with these as well. Because, you know, they are a little bit less powerful and easier to control than most 357 Magnum loads, with our 125 grain standing out as being really, really comfortable to shoot. So again, thank you to Dan the Wolfman for sending those grips and for sending this ammo over for me to test. It's always kind of fun to, you know, he sends ammo, says do what you can do with that. Sometimes he sends ideas, and sometimes I go through my inventory and I come up with my own ideas to add to that. So it's kind of an interesting, fun thing to do. So thank you again to Dan the Wolfman for sending this ammo over and making this video happen. So as always, comment, share, like, and thanks for watching.